a new set of this. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to my medieval sewing party. I am the creative Contessa, and this morning we're actually going back to 16th century Joseon to talk about clothing as worn by women in that era, and very specifically, I'm going to be discussing with you my findings from my recent museum visits to examine extant original garments worn by women in the 16th century in Korea that have survived to this day. And I have learned so much by being able to hold these garments in my hands or direct someone else to hold them in their hands and look at them up close and personal. As always, of course, we're going to commence with the traditional getting dressed, but this morning I'm going to be getting dressed in what I call a semi-18th century Joseon style. I do not have any 16th century Joseon era garments yet, so I thought I'd put on hanbok, but from an 18th century style, so that you at least get a little bit of the vibe for the garments that we're going to be discussing today. So yeah, I've already put on my undergarments because, yeah, YouTube has YouTube has some rules. So I'm now just, I've already put on my many layers actually. I've already put on my dansokot. These are basically like culottes these ones actually are these are based on 16th and 17th century versions. And these are made from hemp, and they are actually, I can't hold this up. This won't get me banned from YouTube. They are made from hemp, and they are super duper comfortable, and they are one of the layers that provide some of the volume that you see in hanbok from the pre-modern era. Right? They didn't have crinolines like everyone wears in Korea now with their hanbok, but they definitely had um, but they had other ways of creating volume that were actually much more comfortable and much more breathable. So yeah. Do Korean secret culottes count as underwear? Yeah, they're underwear. Are they underpants? I mean, they act like underpants, but women in Joseon also wore underpants, like you understand what underpants are. So they had both, right? Okay. Then I've got a couple of different kind of under layers. These are linen, but in the Joseon dynasty, they would have been raimi or hemp. So we're working on that. Next, I'm going to put on one of several different chima, several different skirts. This is another way that volume was created in this era, layering on the skirts. Rather than having one single petticoat, you just had a bunch of different chima wrap skirts, basically. And this one is made of raimi, which is nettle cloth. And it wraps, and then you tie a knot. And then we go with another layer. Another chima. This one is blue raimi. And in the 18th century in particular, in the Joseon dynasty, one of the big fashions was for women to layer their skirts in different colors, like there's their chima in different colors, and then to cleverly stitch up or pin up the overskirt so that you could see some of the underskirt in a fetching fashion. And it was actually, ironically, the giseng, the professional entertainers, the courtesans of the Joseon dynasty, who started that fashion, but it was the noble women who picked up on that fashion, and the women, the wives, the respectable wives of the moneyed merchant class who also picked up on that fashion. And so there are actually documents from the 18th century, men complaining about how their wives are dressing stylishly like giseng and how they wish they would go back to wearing clothing that was of a more modest nature. But it shows that even in the repressive and oppressive Neo-Confucian society of the Joseon dynasty, women found ways to assert their own identity and to assert their own independence, and how even though we have this idea that they always obeyed their fathers, their husbands, and their brothers, it's very clear they didn't, because these men were bemoaning that they couldn't seem to actually force them to do this thing that they wanted them to do. Of course, it could have just been the men protesting too much about the way the women were dressing immodestly because they felt that they had to protest about the immorality of it as part of their Neo-Confucian training, when in reality they really appreciated how the ladies of their household were dressing in this much more attractive, much more stylish fashion. Yeah, one never really knows. Good morning, Ayla. Thank you for joining us this morning. Yeah. Right. Okay. So I've got two chima on, and that's all we're going for today. And you will notice. Oh, hold on a minute. Let me back the camera up. Let me back the camera up. Also, question about the sound. Is the sound quality good? I'm wondering if it's actually my microphone picking up that I have here, or if it's the internal camera. So now that I've moved the camera away, let me know if you can actually hear me. For those just joining, good morning and welcome to my medieval sewing party. But today we're actually going to 16th century Joseon, and I will be discussing 16th century women's clothing in Korea. And right now we're just going through a little bit of a getting dressed. If you're enjoying this, double tap that screen and consider subscribing. Yeah. Oh, that's lovely, Tamakor. I think it's excellent for your young ladies to watch, and we can hear great. Perfect. Splendid. Okay. So I there would actually be from here, and I don't have all these layers yet. I'm working on it. There should be another one or two dogari that come over top of this. There should be a doksam. We're going to be talking about two doksam from the 16th century today, which are basically like undershirts under dogari. And then over top of that would come a slightly more fitted and tailored one. And then over top of that would come this dogari. So this is an 18th century style jogori. It is shorter than they were wearing in the 16th or the 17th centuries, but it is certainly longer than they were wearing at the end of the 18th and into the 19th century. And it has two sets of ties, right? So we've got an inner set of ties and we've got an outer set of ties. And this actually was considered part of the aesthetic of the garment because these ties, these korom as they're called in Korean, then can lay really nicely and drape down. And it was in the Joseon dynasty when ornamentation was increasingly viewed with a jaundiced eye because it was viewed as immodest and not in keeping with Neo-Confucian principles. The ladies had to find other ways, the men too. The men and the women had to find other ways to ornament themselves because humans will human, as they say. So we just tie that there off to the side so that then these ribbons just hang down very elegantly like that, right? And then we tie it here. And in this era, so the modern haute koram, as this kind of knot is called, is done like this with the bow pointing to the side. But in a lot of the visual evidence from the 18th centuries, I started looking more closely. The women are not, and I haven't looked closely at the men, but I'm going to bet it's the same. They're not tying it to the side. They're tying it so that it ends up pointing upward like this. So this is the kind of knot that you actually see in the Joseon dynasty in the 18th century. No longer, they haven't moved to the sideways pointing bow yet. But if I were to wear this, like if I were to go outside now and wear this 18th century style ensemble out and about, I would get corrected. They would try to show me how to properly do a knot because most Westerners, like most Americans, French people, English people, Germans, they don't actually, Koreans, modern Koreans don't have a familiarity with the heritage of their fashions. They look at Hanbok, Korean clothing, which that literally means as a traditional garment that has never changed and it's always been the same. And unfortunately, K-drama is really is cementing their idea that this is just how Hanbok has always looked when it's not true in the least. Yeah. Okay, questions. Let me see. Will your doksam, Jeoksam, will my doksam be silk or rainy? I'm going to make one of both. So the doksam is the under jogari. It's the layer that goes underneath of this. And I'm going to make one of each because one is better for winter and one is better for summer. And the Koreans knew that. Okay, so here's how the clothing looks. At any rate. And one of the big differences between modern Hanbok and pre-19th century Hanbok is where the chima sits. So in the 18th century, even up to the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, the chima in the first half of the 19th century, the skirt sits here on the waist and low. If you actually look at the very few depictions we have of women in regular clothing from the Joseon dynasty, when you can actually, in the 18th century, you look at these pictures by Shinbok, I don't remember the Shinbok Yun. Um, the waists of the chima are very low and maybe even lower than the natural waist, like maybe even leaning a little bit into their hips. But Koreans also have long torsos, so it might just be the long torso of the Korean women of that era. But you actually, the chima, you see all the waist and the chimas are super tight. And so they actually have shaping, unlike the modern style hanbok where the chima comes up to here and you've got this short little jogori that only comes down to here. That's a modern style. That's by the end of the 19th century, the hanbok, the Korean clothing fashions for women, the chima are up here around the breast, right under the armpits, and they're tied so tightly that it actually starts causing health issues, memory health issues for women. And the jogori are so short that it's basically just from the sleeves. It's a line straight across the chest, and it's also tied so very tightly. But that's a fashion at the very end of the 19th century. Does not reflect earlier styles in fashion. Okay, Twitchy Witch, you're back. I was beginning to wonder and worry about you. We haven't heard very much from you in a while. I assume you've been busy getting out to reenactor or LARPing things, though. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Twitchy. So this is Rami. These are 2 layers of Rami. And then in the Joseon dynasty, this would be cotton, hemp, or Rami. If it's white, it would be cotton or Rami, likely cotton. Cotton was actually a very common fabric choice in the Joseon dynasty, starting in and actually before that. It seems that cotton got imported to Korea during the Shilla dynasty and maybe even during the Three Kingdoms period. So we're talking 4th, 5th century AD. The cotton basically becomes prevalent in Korea, and they start growing their own cotton here. So they're not even importing it. They actually start growing their own strain of cotton here on the Korean peninsula. So what's wrong? Oh, what in God's name?
Is it clear for everybody else?
How's the visuals, everyone? Ryan's phone is shaking like a Monet painting if Monet had gotten drunk and painted. Oh my goodness, yeah. So the layers, cotton is a very common fabric for even aristocratic women throughout the Joseon dynasty, especially for the underlayers. The rest of the social classes, so the lower social classes in Korea in the Joseon dynasty, all their layers were generally cotton. They sometimes had hemp, but mostly cotton was the fabric of choice for the majority of the population, and undyed cotton, no less. That's why Joseon, at the end of the dynasty, when it was very, very impoverished, everyone was wearing undyed cotton garments, basically, and everyone was walking around in white clothing. And so Joseon got the nickname of the land of the white people, not because of the color of their skin, but because the majority of people were wearing white garments. Yep. Blurry picture. Okay, great. Fantastic. Who knows what's going on? I will try something. Let's see what we can do. For God's sake, why? Okay, I just unplugged some stuff and replugged some stuff. Has that helped at all? That cleared it up. Well, what the... Yes, modern technology is why I do medieval living history. Okay, so this is... And this is about the level of poof that you would actually have. I could actually wear another pair of dansulkot under this. That would give it even more floof. But the floof would all be kind of here, actually, from the hips, or a paji, actually, pants. And I haven't made those yet. But ladies wear pants in this era. And not underpants, pants. But that would actually create this kind of silhouette, not the modern bell silhouette. And that's another big difference between historical hanbok and the silhouette of the historical hanbok versus the silhouette now. The silhouette now is predicated on a Western style of crinoline that they did not have in the Joseon dynasty, or any dynasty in Korea for that matter. Yep. So yeah, okay, great. Wait, did someone get robbed? Did I miss something? Twitchy got robbed? Oh no. Oh no, Twitchy. Oh no, I am so sorry to hear that. Were you mugged, or did they take them from your purse when you weren't looking? Oh my God, I've had my car stolen. So I know exactly what that feels like. I awoke one morning and my car was no longer in the driveway. Someone had taken it in the night, and my car at that time had my sewing machine and all of my medieval sewing projects in it. Oh, and my wallet. And my freshly cashed paycheck. So yeah, I understand exactly how that horrible feeling. It is exhausting and distressing, 100%. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Uh, okay, I'm glad you weren't injured, but emotionally it's stressful, intensely stressful. At least it was for me, as you can tell. Almost 30 years later. Yeah, almost 30 years later, I still remember it like it was yesterday. Yeah, oh God. 777-pound locksmith fee. Oh, that's insult to injury, right? To have to pay to get into your home when someone has stolen your keys and your money. I am so sorry to hear that. That's people, people sometimes are horrible. Yeah. Yeah, I bet. The police, when I went to the police about my vehicle being stolen, well, they found it. It got dumped. The car got dumped. The wallet got taken. Anything of value was taken. And the car with the non-valuable sewing machine and sewing projects got dumped in a church parking lot. And I found in the car a empty cigarette pack, gross, that definitely belonged to the perpetrator, because I have never, ever, 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 ever smoked anything in my life, and nor will I ever. And I brought it to the police and I said, hey, the perpetrator left this in the car. You can dust it for prints and arrest them. And the policeman who was at the desk, he really couldn't be bothered. He was like, okay, I'll pass it on. And I could tell that was never going to happen. And no, they never found the person who did it, as far as I know. So yeah, that was really frustrating. So yeah, I hear you, Twitchy. It's real frustrating. Well, I'm really glad that your experience with the police was more supportive than mine. Okay, so I'm dressed at this point. However, we're talking mid Joseon dynasty for this particular look, this particular silhouette. My hair can't just be down like this unless I'm in the midst of mourning a loved one, in which case I would be wearing a white hemp ensemble that is a very specific mourning set of mourning clothing that is completely different from what we would wear in the West for mourning clothing. In the West, we get something really nice and stylish, but in black. No, in the Joseon dynasty, they wore these really not very these very loosely tailored, and tailoring is a strong word, garments made out of basically raw edges made of hemp, to show that the family was in mourning, in this really funky special headdress. So yeah, if I were in mourning, I would be wearing something completely different. So let's go ahead and do my hair. So in the 18th century, there's a couple of different hairstyles, and it seems women in the Joseon dynasty never cut their hair. Their hair was very, 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 very long. My hair, this is my hair at maximum growth. This is it. And it's not very thick. It looks nice and curly, but it's actually, there's not much. I don't have much hair. Korean women tend to grow a lot of hair and thick hair. And women in the Joseon dynasty, not cutting their hair, they would have these massively long braids that they would then weave, like pile onto the top of their head in these very thick braids, very stylish. But if their hair wasn't thick enough to get maximum thickness, they wore wigs. And these wigs were made of human hair. And these wigs were insanely expensive. I mean, like, in some cases, depending on the wig, a month, what would be a monthly mortgage payment for us, or actually several months mortgage payment for us. They were massively expensive items. And they also had fake hair that you could basically braid into your own hair. You know, they did all the same things basically that women in the West were doing to create a more voluminous coiffure when necessary. I don't have a wig that is of that style, and it's kind of hard to get a wig of that style in my color of hair. I have seriously been thinking about, I want to actually buy silk yarn maybe crochet, silk crochet yarn actually, in the color of my hair more or less, and then make either play around with adding thickness and length to my braids, to then my own braids, to then be able to make the stylish face framing braid headdress that they would wear in this era and all the different kinds of styles that they have. But I haven't gotten there yet. So we're going to go with the very plain, very modest Joseon married woman chignon at the back of the head, a bun at the back of the head, consisting of braids that are just wound up into a bun basically, and then held in place with the bignon. The bignon is the hair stick that women wore, and the bignon has a long history, but it changes drastically in how it's used and where it's positioned over the centuries. In the Shilla era and the Koryo era and early Joseon, including the 16th century, the bignon was not a horizontal stick. It was, you were into your hair pointing down. And so they looked completely different. But this is an 18th century style bignon, when they have migrated towards the horizontal hair sticks for married women. And married women always wore their hair up. Always, always, always. It was unmarried ladies who wore their hair down and in a braid with that cute little ribbon at the end. Married women did not wear ribbons in their hair, sadly. Not in 18th century Joseon at any rate. Okay. And yes, if I were doing the really faithful reproduction of the style of the time, I would actually put rice bran oil in my hair, comb it in to make it all nice and shiny. That's one of the ways that Asian women, not just Korean women, but Asian women in general, actually achieve beautiful, shiny hair. Rice bran oil was the hair oil of choice. And however, their hair is of a completely different kind. The kind of hair that Korean women have is very different from the kind of hair that I have. And when I use rice bran oil in my hair, it just gets really heavy and dull. So I tried it. It just doesn't work for me, unfortunately. But they would also actually comb their hair back really tightly from the front of their hair, so that, and the rice bran oil would make sure that there were no floofies anywhere, because any kind of little wispy hairs sticking out would be an indication of impropriety and of disorder, which is completely counter to the Neo-Confucian narrative of everything in its place, everything neat, everything perfectly orderly, which is why those complex hairstyles involving these braids wrapped around and piled in different ways offended these Neo-Confucian scholars, who were all nobility, so much, because it was completely counter to the idea of balanced harmony, modesty, and orderliness.
I have to go destroy some people.
Here?
Potentially.
On my live stream?
No.
Oh.
The vet. I'm going to the vet.
Oh, right. Okay.
Because of the thing.
Got it. Okay, got it.
But I have tagged some products, including some traditional Hanbok.
Oh.
Not very traditional.
Right.
It's all the modern
Right.
stuff.
If you're
Not
interested,
the clothing.
not the
hair stuff.
The hair stuff. Okay.
Because all the clothing seem to be really suspect sellers.
There's a couple I have tagged from on my travel channel, I think, from the US. Good ones. Yeah. Okay. So this is something I do myself. It's not, hold on, I just realized my microphone is buried. Okay, repositioned the microphone. Okay, so this is how I do this quick and dirty braid myself. The ladies in Joseon had these hairpins that would not stay in my hair for anything in the world, because they're just too big. And my hair is not big. It is not voluminous. It is not thick. Okay. And then I'll have Ryan check and reposition it as necessary. But the goal is to try to basically get it through all the layers of braids. Like that. Nope.
Oh, we're using this poor one.
Yeah, because I don't know where the other one is.
I'll go get it.
You know where it is? Someone cleaned up and didn't tell me where things got put yesterday. Okay, questions. Do the color of the hanbok have any symbolism? Okay, Amy, that is... Oh, thank you, Vaccinator. Appreciate that. Do the colors have any symbolism? So I haven't found any evidence of colors having symbolism in this era. There are some colors that are regulated for court attire. So there's a lot of regulations about court attire, right? This is a more simple, less gold mino. Court attire has strict regulations for men and women about who is allowed to wear which colors. So that gets regulated, and that would have symbolism in the sense of people would look at the clothing you're wearing and know what your rank and your function at the court was. But that doesn't seem to have carried through to daily wear as far as I can tell. Yeah, okay, that actually stayed. Wow, okay.
Woo! I did it right the first
There we go.
time. Oh, and you're answering the color question?
Yes, I'm
Sweet.
answering the color
There
question.
you go.
There it is. Hopefully I'm actually standing in front of the camera and you can see it. But colors, color regulation, sumptuary regulation, clothing regulation it's something that happens kind of throughout Korean history on and off, depending on the dynasty. In the Shilla dynasty, they did regulate colors based on rank, also for court attire. But again, it doesn't seem to have necessarily passed on to daily wear. So, in the West, they get I'm trying to figure out where to put this damned heavy thing. We really need to get a Lavelier. Maybe that will work. Maybe. Damn it. We need to get a Lavelier. This joggery has the kind of collar that it doesn't support a heavy microphone. Let me see if I can put this here. Maybe here. Okay, just let me know if you all can still hear me or not. So, in the West, sumptuary regulation is all about economic control, and it's about ensuring that everyone dresses according to their station, right, and not above it. So that's really the important thing in Western regulation. But in Korea, in the Joseon dynasty, why is this being so funky? In the Joseon dynasty, it's as much about regulating order. Keeping everything in its order and making certain that people are visually recognizable in their official capacity. So there's less concern about the economic aspect of it, and there's much less concern about what people are wearing in their daily lives. And especially because court attire was not fashion. In Korean society, as in Chinese society through all the various dynasties, the attire of court officials and the ladies of the court and the eunuchs of the court, anyone who worked in the royal palaces in any kind of official capacity, they all had a uniform. And those uniforms didn't change very much. They changed somewhat, but not massively. And those were not fashion garments. They were not fashionable. So that meant that people could not express themselves as individuals at all if they were on the job in the palace, which is why, basically I think there was some kind of tacit acknowledgement that because we're regulating these people so tightly when they're at work, maybe we shouldn't imply or impose the same strictures on them when they're in their limited private time, because everyone needs a little bit of freedom now and then, right? Okay, great question. Can hear you fine. Fantastic. Appreciate it. Okay, let me see. You were Morris dancing. Oh, I am so sorry. I'm really sorry to hear that, Twitchy. Right, okay, so are there any questions about my particular ensemble? I dress in almost exactly this outfit on a fairly regular basis, and I spend all my day dressed this way. And I go out into the world. I can actually lower this. And I go out into the world and do all the things. Take public transit, ride in taxis, go on long walks up and down the mountain or by the river. I go shopping. I can cook in this. I could do a variety of very physically intensive exercises in this. So it's actually a very comfortable outfit. But you want to hear the funniest thing? That I get asked by Koreans when they see me this way. First off, the first thing they say, always, and I mean everyone, mean teenage girls say this too. You are so beautiful. That is such a beautiful outfit. Even the mean teenagers are telling me that, right? But everyone from little children and boys and girls, by the way, all the way up to the extreme elderly, love to see me out and about dressed this way. They love the colors. They love the look. They're so honored that a Westerner is they feel honored, right? They tell me this. I'm not putting these words in their mouth. They feel honored that a Westerner respects and loves their history and culture so much that she's willing to make these garments in some cases and wear them. So there's no question of cultural appropriation here, people. That is not how Koreans feel about their clothing. That is not how they feel about other people wearing their traditional or historical garments. So just toss that Western white savior idea out the window. The Koreans don't need you to save them from having their culture appropriated. They like it when they see fashion designers from the West using these traditional lines in their fashion collections. They see it as a validation of them as an important player on the world stage, and both modern and historically. So just going to get that out there right now. But the other thing that many Koreans ask me, especially women, not so much the men, but the women, they say, isn't it inconvenient? Isn't it uncomfortable? Like, uncomfortable? No, what is there to be uncomfortable? I've got full range of motion, right? Because of the geometric construction, I can do everything in this. I'm unlike modern cuts of clothing, which have arms eyes that really do restrict how much you can raise your arms if your garment is at all fitted. But this garment is fitted. It actually fits my form. It's not big and baggy. And even still, I can do all the things with it, right? So what is uncomfortable here? I don't understand their words. And it all moves with me, right? It's not heavy. These layers are not heavy. It's all natural fiber, so it breathes. So I don't sweat. I don't get hot. I don't get cold. I maintain a comfortable homeostasis. So it's a very fascinating question to me, and it shows a prejudice towards historical garments that tells me they haven't spent enough time in real historical garments to understand how they feel, because unfortunately modern Koreans, especially women, are wearing the modernized hanbok, and that involves modern Western underlayers that are so uncomfortable because they're wearing their skirt up here around their chest. They have these petticoats with crinolines that are made of synthetic fabric, and they've got scratchy crinoline, scratchy toile crinoline layers like itching against their skin, and it's made of polyester or rayon that doesn't breathe, and they're intended to bind the breasts super tightly to completely flatten the chest for the flat chest hanbok look. So they've got this zipper that just completely constricts their upper chest, or their mid to upper chest, and the straps on these petticoats are also super uncomfortable because the whole thing is tight. So yeah, if I were to wear that, it would be uncomfortable and I wouldn't want to do that. But if you actually go back to the historic way that people dressed on a regular basis for literally hundreds of years, it's perfectly comfortable. And I think that's where the disconnect lies, is that most Koreans have never worn the historic versions of their garments. They've only worn the modernized traditional style, which also brings us to the idea of traditional does not equal historic. That word cannot be used as a synonym for historical. It just can't. It doesn't apply. Traditional is anything that's been done twice, honestly. And even traditional clothing can change stylistically and evolve. So at what point, how is it traditional? Does the word traditional in that context only differentiate between modern mass-produced Western wear versus more local styles, or styles that actually reflect a local culture? Is that, in which case I feel like the word tradition is getting abused there, and maybe we shouldn't be using the word in that context, but that's a linguistic debate. Let me see what you all have been saying. Ursula Bear says, that does look comfortable, though I learned decades ago that I'm apparently allergic to Rami. That is so sad. I am so sad. Well, okay, but Ursula, you're talking about when Rami was being used in garments in the 80s. Um, if that was the last time you were exposed to Rami, you might want to see about traditionally woven Korean Rami, because it might not have been the Rami itself, possibly. It might have been the chemicals that were used in those garments that they were making back in the 80s. Yeah. But yeah, so if that was the last time, you might want to find someone I don't know if you're going to Pennsic, I can bring some of my Raimi stuff with me, and then you could see if it's the same effect. Using the facilities must be challenging in that outfit. Lori loves that. Is Lori? That's a great comment, and I do appreciate that. It is the thing that makes it challenging isn't the skirts. Skirts are super easy. In fact, I'll demonstrate what you do with the skirts. So with the skirts, you just make a burrito. Right, all the skirts. Let me show you the full burrito skirt. So you actually take the bottommost layer of your skirtage. Burrito. Okay, and then you have your dansokot, right? These underpants. Then you just treat these like pants, and it's just got a tie over here, right? So you undo the tie and you just drop them. It's like wearing pants, right? It's not a problem. The problem can be sometimes in public restrooms where you're in a stall and the stall is narrow. So that can be a problem, but it's no more challenging, really. It's only slightly more challenging than modern clothing. And God knows if you were wearing a Western dress that goes to the ground with all the layers that it entails, it's just as challenging. Yeah, the most challenging thing, if I'm in a public restroom, is that I don't necessarily want my dansokot to end up on the ground. But I mean, that's the same issue with pants, right? Like when you are wearing pants and you go to the bathroom in a public place and you have to lower them, you're worried about them going too far down sometimes. So I just have developed a technique where I kind of splay my lower legs out to keep it tensioned enough so it doesn't drop to the ground if that's what I don't want to have happen. But yeah, I've developed techniques. I call it the burrito. Let me see. It was a well-washed sweater. A well-washed sweater with Raimi in it? That is so weird. Why would a sweater have Raimi in it? The 80s was a weird time. 9th century. Ursula, are you talking about 9th century Korea? Because I can talk about 9th century in Korea too. Fashion-wise, there's a lot of good stuff there. Oh, Booty Cream Cheese, thank you for the sparkles. Really appreciate it. Yeah, the 80s were a weird time. I only have very vague memories of the 80s as a very little girl. So I missed most of the weirdness as a participant in it, but I have memories of how people were dressing, and the music videos and all the pop culture stuff. It was a different time. Okay, what did I just walk into? Thomas Haley, you have walked into demonstrating how to use the bathroom in 18th century Joseon fashion. So yeah, I just wanted to point out that you can see what I meant about the underkoram, the sokoram, basically, acting like an extra little bit of ornamentation, hanging out delicately. And then you've got the koram of the skirt, and you've got the koram, the outer koram of the outside of the jogori. Now, I will tell you that technically, and I was very frustrated. So I had these skirts made when I first arrived here the last time, and I was very frustrated because the seamstress did not listen to me at all. And instead of making this a white band, it should actually be white cotton. She made the band out of the same Raimi as the skirt. So this should technically be a white band. And that's generally what you're seeing when you see the white band. The white around their waist isn't a separate garment generally. It's the white band of the chima, of the skirt. And that is made out of a specially woven cotton. Very nice, very densely, very finely woven cotton for women of this social class, right? I'm wearing silk. So this automatically tells you I am not your random servant wandering around the Joseon countryside harvesting things, right? This is clearly the ensemble of Yangban. And with my hair like this, I'm absolutely Yangban. I am not Giseng. Giseng are the ones who wear their hair in these amazing wig configurations, I guess is the word I would use. If that is poor folk clothes, or yeah, is that poor folk clothes or rich folk clothes? Yeah, this is rich, 100%. The members of the lower ends of society in Joseon, there's to say rich and poor, that's a little, that lacks certain nuance, because there were nobles who were poor, relatively speaking, in the Joseon dynasty, especially if their family had fallen afoul of the regime somehow, and had been exiled or something like that. So they could still be nobility and not be rich necessarily. But there's a spectrum, right? There are people who are extremely poor, mostly, unfortunately, disabled people, orphans. Yes, there were extremely poor people, but there's a spectrum in there, and just with that spectrum of income goes a spectrum of fashion choices, and specifically fabric choices. But the second you see bright colors like this, and all these layers, and especially the second you see silk with silk brocade, then you know you're talking about a wealthy individual. And that could be a giseng, that could be a courtesan, a professional entertainer, right? They were well educated, they could write in Chinese characters, they could read poetry, they could write poetry, they could play instruments, they could dance, they could engage in philosophical discussions with their clientele, and they dressed very nicely. And they dressed very richly because that was part of the experience, right? Giseng were not just sex workers. It was a whole escort package, very sophisticated, and in many cases they were government employees. Many giseng were actually employed by the government as part of a way to control men's desires and activity, and funnel them into very specific venues so that it would still all be orderly, right? So yeah, this is absolutely 100% something a wealthy woman or a giseng would have worn. But if I were a giseng, I would have a much more elaborate wig going on up here. No, great question. Let me see. Loved the king's favorite meal last night. The king's favorite meal, which is that one of the new K-dramas? Oh, or Ursula Bear, 9th century Irish Norse, not 9th century Sheila. Okay. What did you just walk into? Uh, oh, Namadiyong, thank you. Not only am I wearing, I made this. So this jogori, I made this one, right, myself. I just finished it. Right, it's the first one I've ever actually made, so I'm very first ever jogori I've ever made. I did make these dansoko, right, these underpants. I made these two, but the chima I didn't make, but I'm working on making all of my own now. And you have walked into a discussion about historical Korean fashion. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Let me see. Giseng were the Joseon fashionistas. And yeah, so yeah, Giseng are sort of equal in concept to geisha, right? Not necessarily the same in terms of where they sat on the social hierarchy. I'm not as familiar with with Edo's approach to their geisha, and whether they were official government employees or where they were on the hierarchy. Giseng were on the bottom of the social hierarchy, but they were very free, which is a contradiction that many modern people around which many modern people can't wrap their heads, right? They were on, no matter how wealthy they were on the bottom of Joseon society, and yet they had the freedom to move around at will. They could be educated, they could own property, they could open their own giseng houses and have employees, right? They had all sorts of freedom, but they were at the bottom of society, and they were often wealthier than noble ladies who were higher ranking than them. So it's a contradiction. The world of the giseng is it's an interesting exclave within the Joseon dynasty, is maybe how I would describe it. Thank you, Eiley. I appreciate that. Wouldn't this be hot in the summer? So this would not. That's a great question. Would this be hot in the summer? The jogori might be hot, but I wouldn't wear this in the summer. This is more of a spring, winter, autumn jogori. In the summer, I would wear jogori made out of either really finely woven silk in multiple layers, or I would wear something made out of reimi, which is nettle cloth. That's what this is. This is reimi. This is nettle cloth. Moshi, as it's called in Korean, right? And this is superior to linen in terms of breathability. It's even more effective at evaporative cooling than linen is. And mochi can be woven very, very finely, to the point where it's translucent and or even bordering on transparent. And so these mochi skirts, no, this everything's very comfortable here because you have a layer effect happening here in these skirts. And so basically I've got layers of insulated air so that even though the outside air might be hot, the air trapped within the layers of skirt is not, and it's protected from the sunlight, for instance. So mochi, it breathes well. Rainy, it breathes well, plus the layering effect, it keeps it cool. And if I were to go out in the summer, I would probably not wear this heavier silk jogori. I would wear something made of mochi reimi, or possibly cotton, but as a noble woman, probably more likely mochi reimi. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I did it myself. Yep. Appreciate the compliment on the hair. Yeah, yeah. 한국어로 조금만 해요, right? I can speak a little bit of Korean, and I can read a lot of Korean. Let me see. Need to get some makgeolli and panton to break that outfit in. Dongdongju. Actually, we had some dongdongju on our. So for those who don't know, I also have a travel channel, Travels with the Creative Contessa, and we often go to restaurants and do live streams from restaurants wherever we are in the world. And there was one where we did a live stream, and we actually a couple of months ago, and we actually had dongdongju with our dolsot bibimbap. Yeah, dongdongju is so fun. Okay, so are there any questions before I start talking about my learnings about 16th century Korean fashion? Because I examined these two doksam, these two undergarments, ladies' undergarments from the early 16th century, and it was mind-blowing to see the different ways in which these two same garments basically were constructed in completely different manners, were tailored in a completely different manner, but also utilize some of the exact same techniques that are being used in Europe in the 15th and the 16th century, and also some different ones. So I wanted to share some of that information with you. Yep. Okay, just let me check back through the comments. Okay, wait, there's a question. Does that top wrap over the right or backwards? Japanese in college has me preferring left over right. Okay, so yeah, okay, just making sure that this was mirrored. So here's an interesting tidbit about the historical Korean clothing. If it's a garment that was worn by a living person in life, then it should wrap left over right. Right, so this is my right, this is my left over right, and it wraps left over right. But if garments were made specifically for the tomb, for the grave, for the funeral, then it wraps the other way, then it's a dead person's garment. Right, I learned that relatively recently. And that's one of the fascinating things about Joseon dynasty is how they buried their dead in a way that resulted in not only the preservation of the body accidentally, but the preservation of hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of garments from that era. So in the Shilla dynasty and the Goryeo dynasty, they buried people in a tomb, in a sarcophagus, in a coffin, but they didn't actually put that many things with them in the coffin itself. But in the Joseon dynasty, they start this practice of dressing the deceased in every garment they owned, every garment they owned. And then, if there was room left in the coffin, people, friends and family who respected the recently deceased would donate their own garments to then be packed into the tomb. And then, if there was any room left in the tomb after that, they would put more fabric. And there were some also specifically funerary things. They had specific head wraps that went on the corpse, and leg and foot wraps and arm wraps, hand wraps that were specifically only worn in death. And also shoes that were specially made generally and only made for the corpse, right? But what that means is that basically the body is packed in a lot of fabric and there isn't much oxygen left in the coffin. So it actually resulted in the retardation of decay. So Korea has the largest per capita percentage of wet mummies in the world, as far as I understand, because the bodies only slightly decay. And so when they open these tombs up, they actually find people that look a lot like people that are not that long in the grave. And they can study the contents of their stomach, they can tell how they died, and their clothing therefore is also really well preserved because there wasn't much degradation in the body itself, and also not much oxygen, so not many of the microbes and the chemical conditions that normally result in fabric rotting. So that is why Korea has an insanely massive collection of historical garments starting in the 15th century and going forward. And then before that, in the Goryeo dynasty and the Shilla dynasty, and before that, Shilla dynasty is when Buddhism gets here. There was a custom by which people would donate their garments to a local Buddhist monastery as a relic garment to then be entombed in a stupa, in a stone stupa. So there are ancient stupas, 1,000+ years old, all over Korea, many of which that have garments from that era preserved inside, because again, they were entombed in this stupa. Not much oxygen gets in there, and so or no water for certain, and so these garments are preserved. So in the cases where they have to move a stupa, or a stupa is damaged and then they have to do some kind of study, they find garments that are even older. We have a tolik, the sort of Mongol kaftan style wrap garment that soldiers wore in the Goryeo and then in the Joseon dynasty. We have one from the 14th century, and it is so well preserved. I think it's from Haeinsa, actually, but they won't let us look at it. They won't let, and I don't just mean me, I mean, they won't let Dr. Minji Kim, one of the world's premier experts in historical Korean fashion, they won't let her look at this garment. So it can be a little frustrating sometimes to know that these medieval era garments are there. They're preserved, but we're not allowed to look at them. And they're not on display either. I don't just mean that we can't look at them in person. I mean, they're not even on display. How frustrating is that? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I've been wondering if it was a mirror image. As I understand it, Japan was the same. Yep, it was. We had Dongdongju the other day. Wait, who did we? We didn't have Dongdongju. Who is we? Who is this we, Kimosabi? Good night, Tommy Core. Thank you for joining us. Yep. Okay. So, yeah, that is one of the reasons that we have so many garments that have survived. So the two garments that I examined, and unfortunately I scheduled this through YouTube, not thinking about the way they don't really allow screen sharing. Right, they still don't allow screen sharing. Yeah. So I'm going to schedule another 16th century Hanbok live stream chat in which I will show pictures and talk about the things we're seeing in the pictures, because I can do that through my Restream software and upload pictures, and then we can look at pictures together. So this is going to be more of a casual talk about what I've observed and answer your questions. If you have any questions about historical Korean fashion, I've been studying it from the Goguryeo era through to the 18th century, and I have knowledge of the 19th century as well to some degree. So I can answer questions on a wide variety of eras of Korean history. So feel free to ask me about them. I've been, these last couple of years, I've been working with Dr. Minji Kim. I've been reading all these essays that have been published and going to all these museums, and I've really acquired for a Westerner, quite a lot of knowledge. Yeah, so feel free to ask. Okay, so one of the things that we've learned by opening these graves, and I know some people get offended when I say that these graves were opened. I don't mean that a tomb raider went in, opened the grave, tossed the body to the side, and stole the clothing. Korea is a developing country. And I mean that in the sense of they are growing rapidly, and they are redeveloping and developing new infrastructure, building new train tunnels, building new highways, and that takes things through the mountains. And the mountains and the hills are where people historically were buried in Korea throughout most of Korean history, but especially in the Joseon dynasty. And so when they go to build a new highway through a mountain system, invariably they're going to cut through some clan's family graveyard, basically their private mountain family cemetery, because before Christianity there weren't communal cemeteries. You had your family plot. And I'm not exactly certain, actually I don't know what the lower classes of Joseon did. I kind of only know the burial practices for the upper classes in that regard. So what happens is they let a family know, because there are actually records about where all of these graves are. Clans actually keep an illustrated log mapping out where their ancestors' tombs are going back centuries. I can't even imagine that kind of continuity. It's like the equivalent of the family Bible that some of us in the US and in Europe have, that records the births in our family line going back several centuries. It's like that, but even better, because it shows literally where the bodies are buried. And so these records are also kept centrally, and so the government will know, well, there's the Andong Kim clan has a plot here, but we need to build a road because our country is growing and we're advanced, and we no longer rely on tiny roads that wind up and down the mountain. We want the road to go through the mountain. So they reach out to the family and they say, whoever the representative of that family is, and they say, we're going to be building a road. We will be excavating, we will be carefully excavating the grave. We will be doing a study. What would to what degree would you like us to do this study? Do you want us to just exhume the body and help you move it somewhere else? Do you want us to do we have your permission to actually do an archaeological study so that we can actually learn more about our own culture and history? And very, very often the families are completely copacetic with the tomb being studied in depth, because they recognize that this is a way to learn more about Korean history, and that it's a unique opportunity that many other countries don't have. So they don't view it as a violation of their ancestors' graves. They view it as a contribution to the understanding and knowledge of Korean culture and history. Obviously, not all the families feel that way. Some of them have said, no, please just relocate the grave, don't do any kind of archaeological studies, and then none were done. But many have been studied, and it's very respectfully done, and then the deceased are often re-entombed in some fashion in accordance with the wishes of the family. But that's why we have all of these garments, because of all the development that has been happening in Korea over the last many decades. Yeah. Let me see. Questions or comments? Anthony, thank you for joining us today. Did you notice if Hanbok fabric was pieced together from all of the fabric? You're talking about, so if we're talking about these two extant garments that I've examined now, in total, 7 extant garments from the 16th century. For the most part, the garments are absolutely pieced together in a geometric way that minimizes the waist. But they're also pieced together in such a way that no excess seams are created. That if you don't need to have a seam is not used. They just use the panel of fabric as it is. And that is the case in the reimi, the moshi joksam, the reimi undershirt. That actually, the layout, this is the diagram for the sleeve. It's actually a long rectangle with a little rectangle hanging off the bottom. And that little rectangle folds up into a square gore rather than inserting a square gore. That's what I refer to as the faux gusset. So yes, they are, and they're laid out and cut in such a way, these garments, so that every single bit of fabric ends up being used with minimal waste, right? So at the end of the day, the korom are cut out of the offcuts. The sop, that's this little triangular bit here that is additionally to the width of the main garment, right? That is very clearly cut with the undersop, if it's depending on the kind of fabric you're using, in such a way that it takes advantage of that diagonal line, basically cutting a diagonal line down a long rectangle. Or in the case of when you have side gores, then those are actually the offcuts of cutting the sop. So yeah, they're definitely pieced together, and historical Korean fabric, It's a ground loom. It's actually a loom that you actually sit on the ground and work, and it's a horizontal loom. It's not a vertical loom, but they weave fabric that's like 13 inches wide, not very wide at all. So they lay out the garments in such a way that it maximizes the use of that width of fabric. And so in the case of the chima, for instance, the skirts are literally, and this is actually more or less, this is traditional width. This is woven to a traditional width. This is it, right? And so the chima are just rectangles, like long strips of fabric seamed together into one giant rectangle, and then it's knife pleated into a band like this, right? And it's all knife pleating. So far, all of the chima I have examined, three, all three of the extant ones I've examined in person, it's all knife pleating. It's not cartridge pleating, it's not roll pleating, it's not organ pleating, it's not gathering, it's knife pleating, right? And the interesting thing about one of the 16th century, the overskirts, the Godo Chima that I looked at in the Daegu National Museum, it was lined in silk and silk shell. And the weird thing, the thing that blew my mind about this skirt was that the top layer was knife pleated separately from the lining. So the pleats didn't line up at all. So the pleats underneath on the underlayer were different than the pleats on the top layer of the skirt. And it also meant they were pleated separately. Um, that I've never seen that before. I never would have assumed that as an application. I would have assumed that lining and shell were put together and then pleated as a unit, but they were not. But as I'm talking about it to you all right now, it occurs to me one of the effects of having offset pleats might be, and I'll have to experiment with this and see if that's true, when you put it on, that might actually create a little more bulk because the pleats are kind of fighting each other, right? So it might actually create more bulk in how it sits on the body. That's one theory I'm just kind of tossing around in my head now that I'm thinking about it. But that was mind blowing. That was mind blowing that the lining and the shell were not pleated as a unit. They were pleated separately and then attached to the band, the waistband. Okay, questions. Let me see. What do poor folk wear? Appreciate that comment, PGE. That's a great question. What do poor folk wear? So again, I hate the word poor it does a lot of the thinking for us. So I don't like that word. So because there's a gradation in Joseon, especially in early Joseon. So if we're talking 15th and 16th century, there is a much narrower gap between wealthy and poor in Joseon than there is by the end of the Joseon dynasty. And that's because of the rapacious and the rapaciously avaricious aristocrats who eventually consolidate power away from the king as the Joseon dynasty progresses on, right? Their whole goal is just to get rich. They don't give a crap about good governance. But in early Joseon, that's not so much the case. And the laws that get implemented and instituted that keep funneling money into the hands of the aristocrats are not in early Joseon development. They're a mid Joseon development. I'm thinking about taxation, for instance, where it's only the farmers and the tradesmen, the non-nobility who have to pay the taxes. Like, how bullshit is that? The aristocrats are the ones who have all the resources. Why aren't they paying taxes? Does that sound familiar? It's like we can't learn anything from history, right? So yeah, poor people, if we're talking the beggars on the street, right? They're going to be wearing probably garments made of cotton. The women are still going to wear a jogori and a chima, right? It's still going to be a garment like this, but cut out of cotton. And it's going to be a skirt like this, but cut out of cotton. It's not going to be as full, right? There's not going to be as much width to the skirt. She'll have a pair of underpants. They'll probably be made of cotton as well. She'll have paji, she'll have pants underneath, and she'll have boson, the little socks. I forgot to bring a pair of the socks to show you what they look like. But it's just going to be made out of cotton. So it's going to be kind of the same silhouette, just made out of lower end materials, right? The Joseon dynasty is about, the more the Joseon dynasty develops, the more it focuses on modesty, and that applies modesty in appearance, and that applies across all levels of society, not just the downtrodden. It also applies to the aristocrats. So they have to come up with different ways to differentiate themselves sartorially, and it's not the usual way of just wearing giant expensive jewels. Especially as the Joseon dynasty wears on, there's more of a focus on modesty. So the silhouette for people at the bottom end of the spectrum would have been more or less the same. The skirts would have been less full, and the fabrics would have been the much more modest cotton. Would they have been dyed? So there are many plants here in Korea with the clothing of the lower classes have been dyed. In early Joseon, yes, that seems to be the case. By later Joseon, almost everyone who is not an aristocrat is wearing white garments. And I haven't actually read a theory on that, but my theory is that by the end of the Joseon dynasty, Joseon is so impoverished that most people cannot afford dyed clothing. That's a theory. That's just me theorizing based on what I've read about the late Joseon dynasty, but I haven't read that in any official journal article, for instance. But in early Joseon, early to mid Joseon, we have depictions of normal everyday women going about their lives, doing work, and they are generally wearing a blue skirt. And they actually grew indigo here in Korea. They have their own indigo dyeing industry and have had their own indigo dyeing industry since the Shilla dynasty, right? Since the 5th or 6th century, I think, is when indigo was imported as a plant and they started growing it here, right? So there has been an indigo dyeing industry here since forever, and indigo is one of those rare dye stuffs that plays very well with cellulose, meaning cotton, meaning ramie, meaning linen, although they didn't have linen here in Korea, meaning hemp, right? Because otherwise cellulose is actually very challenging to dye using natural dyeing methods. Chemical dye is no problem, but natural dyeing methods, plant-based dyes, it's very hard to get the cellulose to actually absorb the dye stuff and retain it. But indigo is a dye stuff that combines very well with cellulose. So that would be, again, that would be ramie, nettle cloth, hemp, or cotton. And that's why you see a lot of people wearing blue in the Joseon dynasty, because blue is something that plant-based fibers can take, and most people are wearing plant-based fibers. Obviously, it's only people on the upper end of the socioeconomic, maybe not obviously, it's only the people at the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum who are wearing silk. Even though silk is local to here, and Korea had its own silk producing industry, from growing the silkworms to unspooling the cocoons, to spinning, to weaving, to dyeing, to producing all of that, right? Yes, Korea had its own very sophisticated native silk production industry. And even then, silk is still something that is really only reserved for the upper, it's not even reserved, it's just affordable only by the upper classes. So the vast preponderance of people generally are going to be wearing ramie or hemp or cotton. And that's why you see so much blue on average everyday people, because all of those plant fibers absorb blue dye stuffs specifically from indigo in this case very well. Now there are other natural dye stuffs that are here in Korea that aren't in the West. Or aren't used in the West as far as I know. They use safflower here. I haven't read about safflower being used in medieval European dyeing, for instance. So, they had basically the same palette of colors, but they had different plants to do it. But most of these plants almost all of them were local and not imported. So, it wasn't a question of the dye stuffs being expensive. And that's why by the time you see all these people wearing almost nothing but white by the end of the Joseon dynasty, it really does lead me to believe that it's a sign of the economic hardship. Yeah. P. Shivers, thank you for joining us today. Maggot says, I have mulberry trees and a lady comes and gets the leaves for her silkworms. That is so cool. Maggot, if I may ask, what continent do you live? You don't have to give specific details. I'm just curious if you're in Asia or somewhere else. My grandmother worked at the cotton mills and wore wooden shoes. Again, where are those cotton mills, Maggot? Did I miss something? Oh, the Shuriken, thank you for joining. I hope to see you again. Have Have a lovely evening. Okay, let me see. Once the weather is reliably warm, I've got indigo to dye some of my garb. Need to change my red linen underdress to purple. Ah, doing an over dye. Love it. Love it so much. Okay. Yeah, 'twas ever thus indeed. So indigo, indigo dyeing, we don't have a lot of evidence of indigo for the 9th century or so. That's probably more likely to be woad, especially in Ireland. Indigo is not very widespread in medieval Europe, and it mostly seems to be concentrated in the Mediterranean. I would say woad would actually be, if I don't care, obviously I'm not, I'm not trying to judge you on this. I'm not judging you at all. I'm just saying that if you want to be authentic to 9th century Ireland, it should probably be woad that you're using to create that blue, not indigo. West Australia, very cool. That is so cool. Well, thank you for joining us from Australia. I am currently in Daegu, South Korea. Yep. I know, but I also sleep in these. Yep, that's totally cool. No judgment, no judgment at all. Just getting the information out there. Indigo is another one of those polemic topics in European medieval living history circles. And part of the problem stems from the fact that the dye stuff in woad and indigo is exactly the same chemically. And so if you analyze a garment from the 9th century, you're going to get indigen. I think it's called indigen, is the actual dye stuff. But that doesn't mean it comes from indigo. It can also come from woad and is more likely to come from woad. So yeah, that leads a lot of people to assume that there must have been indigo because they see the word indigen and they don't understand how chemicals work, I guess. Okay, so the undergarments that I examined. I examined one that it's called a doksam, and in the romanization, that's Jeoksam. I should have a whiteboard. I can write the Korean for you too. And this is the layer that would be worn on the very base against the skin, basically. And this is the washable layer, right? So this jogori is not wet washable. And it would not have been wet washable even at the time. It would be spot treated, it would be stain treated. There are plenty of very innovative stain treatments utilizing a variety of the natural chemicals that humans have always kind of figured out how to extract from nature. But it would not have been wet washed. But the doksam is the layer that would have been wet washed. And that's why it's made of rimi. And that's why it's made of silk. And contrary to popular belief, you can absolutely wet wash silk. The problem with wet washing silk is then it's going to basically turn into just one big hard water stain. But if it's all wet, then it's all the same color, so it doesn't matter. And you can do some things to mitigate the wet water, the hard water stain, basically, from silk. But you wouldn't want to do it for several reasons. The dye stuffs could run. It'll impact if you've got a different combinations of fabric like you very frequently do in these jogori, then they could shrink at different rates and you're going to end up with weirdnesses. So these were just not wet washed. They were dry cleaned historically, just not using turpentine. That's a 19th century invention as far as I know, and an accidental one no less. Anyway, the doksam is the layer that could be washed and would be washed even if it's made of silk. Wet wash because it's the underlayer and it doesn't matter that the dye stuffs may run. But the thing about the doksam is that invariably they're undyed or they're bleached, but they're not dyed because that is the layer that's going to be washed. Why on earth would you dye that if you're going to wash it in water? Because probably it's going to be hot water and that's going to basically leach out all of your expensive dye stuff anyway. So these two doksam, the silk one and the hemp one, were undyed and or originally white. The silk has yellowed extremely with age, but it was not originally dyed. And even though this garment is 500 years old and spent most of that time in a grave against a corpse's body, the silk was so silky, it flowed like water, and it made it very hard to convince it to lie nice and flat without putting too much stress on it because it had a mind of its own. It was very fun watching the curator try to manipulate this ornery silk undergarment, but it was very gratifying to see just how enduring and durable silk really is. Right? So you've got this beautiful silk, and it was a tabby weave. It was a slubby tabby weave. So that's the other interesting thing. This was not a finely woven silk at all. It was a very slubby silk, big slubs, not finely woven. So very clearly not meant to be an overgarment, and very clearly abuse was the abuse of laundering was an acknowledged reality for this fabric, which also shows us that it illustrates the idea that there are different calibers of silk. There are different grades of silk. And so you can have a really finely woven silk where all of the fibers, all of the threads are exactly the same, basically creating a completely even look like this taffeta, for instance, or you can have a slubby silk that flows like water, but isn't necessarily the most finely woven thing. And in fact, I kept using the word slubby at the museum, and Ryan didn't know what slubby, he never heard that word before. He said, "What's a slub?" I had to show him what slubs are. Yeah. Let me see. How would they carry their coin purse is a question. So the men actually had giant sleeves. They carried their coin purses in their sleeves like pockets. How cool is that? Oh, thank you for that lovely gift of a very fun looking electric guitar. I love those colors. Really appreciate that. Thank you, P Shivers. Appreciate that. So the men actually had one of the most stylish ways that stylish men dressed was they had a po or a daliong, an overgarment with large sleeves, and it would actually they would keep their coin purses in their sleeves, and also a fan. They would keep a fan in their sleeves. They would keep a spoon of their own and a set of chopsticks of their own, so that if they stopped and ate somewhere, they would have their own eating implements with them. So basically their sleeves became their storage systems. Women don't have that option. But the reality is that in the Joseon dynasty, most women didn't leave their homes. Noble women very rarely left their homes. And as the Joseon dynasty wore on, this gets more and more the case. So noble women didn't really necessarily have to worry about how to carry coin purses, because they didn't have to carry coin purses because they didn't often actually go out in the world. Getting married was a bit like a jail sentence in the Joseon dynasty. And that's why when people ask me if I would like to be, if I had to choose between being a giseng or a married noblewoman in the Joseon dynasty, that's not even a debate. Giseng for the win. Whereas the giseng did go out and about, and of course they did have to carry coin purses. So we don't actually see, it's not depicted, there are not many depictions of women from the Joseon dynasty. It's only in the 18th century that we start to see more depictions of them. So we don't have a good idea about where the coin purses were. I haven't really seen that. I think I've seen one depiction of a lady from the 18th century, and I think her coin purse was actually tied up around her haute couronne. But coin purses were little, right? They're really small. They're not big. It's not like a big reticule, right? Women, the reality of the urban system, the urban system being the towns and the cities in Joseon, is that they're walkable. You're not going very far. You don't have to carry everything you could possibly need in a day with you, because you're not going to go and do all these things while you're out. You really just need a coin purse. That's all you need, and maybe your ID tag, depending on who you are. So you don't, now women carry, like I have a tote bag with projects in it, with a hand fan, with all kinds of things. And, it's just the idea of carrying all of these things around with me indicates that we now have these massive cities, and because of transit, I can go really far in the city, and I might not be coming home again until way later in the evening, whereas the size of Joseon cities and towns was much, much smaller, and the distance you would need to go to engage in any activity was not really that far. So you didn't have to carry much with you, because if you forgot something, you could just go back for it. So it's a different mindset. But they did have ways of carrying things. They actually had these cool cloth wrap backpacks. Like imagine a baby Bjorn, not the baby Bjorn, the baby wrap. I forget what that's called. There's a word for it. The baby wrap, right? So imagine that long length of cloth that you can wrap a baby to your chest or to your back. But that instead of putting a baby inside of it, you put things inside of it, right? So they basically had that same kind of system for if they needed to take goods with them, like if they were going out to pay homage at a Buddhist monastery, then they might want to bring some food and drink with them, and they would actually wrap that on, put that onto their backs with them. Noble women wouldn't. Noble women would be carried in a palanquin. That's one of those boxes that's carried by footmen, right? Noble women, they generally didn't go walk places. They were carried places. Sometimes maybe they might ride horses if they're going further, but they had people to carry their things for them. But women, servant women, obviously they did have to go out, and it seems that they probably just tied their purses to their skirts, to their skirt quotum, as it were. Yeah. Tote bag with internal pockets for the winds. Let me see. Oh, Tomikor came back. Popped in to add one last thing. I ordered The Goodman of Paris on Thrift Books for $21. Nice. Good job, Tomikor. Love it. Let's see. Great. Tote bag with internal pockets for the win. Yeah. So yeah, they definitely had ways of transporting things, and it's just a question of who was actually doing the transporting. Anyway, for those of you just joining, welcome to my medieval sewing party, in which I'm apparently not doing any sewing today. I actually have something to work on, but I'm getting so into sharing these details that I forgot to actually do the finger loop braiding, which is a thing that Joseon and Edo women did, and also the dynasty that's before the Edo Japan. That's kind of the Warring States period. But yeah, so I was going to demonstrate, be working on. I guess I can still do that. A project while we actually chat. Let's see, other things, observations about this garment. So when you make an undergarment, something that's going to go under layers and layers of clothing, one of the key features should be that it is what we would call narrow profile, slim profile. You don't want a bulky undergarment. You don't want bulky seams. You don't want bulky hems if you can avoid it, because there are going to be other layers going on top, and you don't need to add bulk from the very start. So that was actually borne out really heavily in this joksam, in this silk undergarment, and also in the hemp, its hemp cousin. The seams, first off, selvages were utilized in all cases. Wherever it was possible, they just used the whole width of the fabric, and they just seamed two selvages together. So in the cases where selvages were the seams, there was no seam finishing, because why waste time? The selvage is finished. It doesn't need to be finished. It will not unravel. And I measured the seam allowances on selvage seams was 2 millimeters in many cases. And it was a running stitch. It was either a running stitch or a running back stitch or a back stitch that they put right close to the edge of the selvage to minimize the fabric that would end up in the seam allowance instead of in the bulk of the fabric. 2 millimeter seam allowances, which is absolutely inconceivable by modern standards. And you couldn't do that with a machine. A sewing machine couldn't handle a 2 millimeter seam allowance. It would just destroy the fabric, push the fabric into the sewing plate, the bobbin plate. So tiny, tiny seams, and no finishes, no extraneous finishes. So it was a very economical garment in terms of construction. Whereas the equivalent garment in Europe in the 15th or 16th century, even if the seam doesn't need finishing, it's going to get finished because they wanted to create a symmetry of finishing effect generally. Nope, not these garments, didn't care about that. Just cared that it was pragmatically finished if it needed to be. Otherwise, it was just left the seam. The other interesting thing is that on the silk joksam, after I looked really closely, I realized that each of the panels were actually hemmed first, and then they were seamed together. Then the seams were sewn. And you can tell that based on the way the bottom is. You can see that the hem has actually been caught, the rolled hem has been caught up in the seam. And that blew my mind but that's the silk garment. On the reime garment, on the reime joksam, they put all the seams together, sewed all the seams, and then they hemmed the bottom. So 2 different ways of approaching hem or seam finishing. And I'll have to look at more silk joksam versus reime joksam to see if there's some kind of standard. Silk joksam are always finished where you hem each panel first and then seam it together, sew it together. Reimi Doksam are always sewn together and then hemmed. I've only looked at two, one silk, one Reimi, so I can't make any calls about how frequent that is, but I'm now going to look at a couple of others to see if I can get a sense for a standard practice, if there was a standard practice, and if it was different based on the fabric that was being used for the garment. Yeah. How did men keep things from falling out of their sleeves? Oh, that's a good question. So the sleeves of these garments, right? If it's a sleeve like this, um, the only opening is up here for the wrist. The rest of it is closed. So basically you create this giant pocket, this giant pouch for things. And if Ryan were here, I would have him fetch his because he has one. he has a dogori with big sleeves. And he when he wears it, he keeps his wallet and his phone in it. So yeah, it does, things don't fall out. They just don't. Because one, the opening is only here big enough for the hand to fit through. Two, because of the weight, even when you put your arms down, the pocket, the so-called pocket, hangs down way lower than the opening, so nothing will fall out. That's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. Darn it, I was going to work on finger lip braiding for you all, and I apparently left a mess here last night. I think I may have overscheduled my live stream schedule. I had 2 live streams yesterday for a total of, I don't know, 8 hours of live streaming. One of them was a medieval cooking party, which was really intense. And then the stream this morning, and I think maybe 3 live streams in 24 hours is too many. Oh my goodness, yeah. So the other interesting thing about these, just in general, the way the silk garment was put together, is that it did not have reinforcement at the shoulders, a reinforcing patch at the shoulders. Whereas the Reimi undergarment, the Reimi Doksam did. It had a complete panel that went across the neckline, by the way, across the neckline and in the back, across the shoulders to reinforce this spot. And considering that the first jogori I ever had made in 2015, considering that it wore out right here, I realized it should have had that patch. Putting that reinforcing patch in is brilliant because that's the same spot that wears out on my medieval linen undergarments right here. It wears out here and it wears out here. But they actually acknowledge that. And so on Reimi and hemp Joksam, they actually have a reinforcing patch. Interestingly, the silk one did not have the reinforcing patch. And that could be because plant fibers are, I think they deteriorate faster than silk does. So especially from wear and tear. Let me see. Nani Mori, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to my normally medieval sewing party, but today we're talking 16th century Joseon fashion while I'm wearing 18th century Joseon fashion. And because I can't find my silly spool of thread, I think the cat's probably made off with it, unfortunately. Probably going to have to locate it somewhere. The project I was going to work on, I can't actually work on this morning. Isn't that frustrating? Well, first world problems, yeah. So if you're joining and you're enjoying this live stream, please double tap that screen and consider subscribing. If you have any questions about the history of Korean fashion, about historical Korean clothing, Hanbok as it's called now, pop them in the live stream. That actually gives me a chance to talk about the word Hanbok briefly. Han is an old word that means Korean, actually. Bok, B-O-K, means clothing. So this is a term that is actually coined at the end of the 19th century when when Europe is colonizing Asia, and places like Japan are westernizing, right? They're starting to wear Western fashions. And so it's and Koreans as well, especially Koreans in the upper echelons. The King Gojong is a very big fan of Western everything. So he starts dressing in a very Western fashion. So it becomes necessary to distinguish linguistically in between those two fashions, between the Korean style and the Western style. And so the term Hanbok is coined then. But before the end of the 19th century, that term doesn't exist. It's just clothing. And each of the garments is just, it has its own name, right? And there are so many garments that are not reflected in modern Hanbok that historically existed. And there's a huge vocabulary to address those different garments, that, Hanbok becomes this all-encompassing term, but it doesn't describe anything except for saying that it is Korean clothing. Okay. Have you looked at any historical garments up close? Oh, saw us. Yes. Yes, this is what we're talking about, actually. I have now been to 2 museums and I have examined in person, holding with my hands and looking with my eyes, 7 garments. 7 garments. I've looked at 2 Doksam, just at the Seoul, the National Folk Museum in Seoul, Gungnim Minso Panmokwan, right? I have looked at the 2 undergarments, a silk undershirt called a doksam and a remi doksam, and that's what we're talking about today. And here in Daegu, I went to the Daegu National Museum and I looked at 3 different 16th century chima, a pair of dansokot. Yeah, a pair of dansokot and another garment, maybe 2 pairs of dansokot. Yeah, looked at 5 garments. 5 garments in an hour and a half was way too many. Way too many. So I have a lot of learnings about how these garments were constructed and how they actually feel firsthand. So yeah, it is very cool. And that's what we're talking about today. I had planned to show you pictures, but then I realized I scheduled this through YouTube and not through my Restream software. So I can't show you pictures on YouTube, but I plan on scheduling another live stream where I'll actually show pictures and discuss my learnings and understanding about construction techniques based on the pictures. So stay tuned. I haven't scheduled it yet. If you're interested in watching that live stream, subscribe, click the notification bell, and make sure you turn all notifications on, not just custom, if you actually want to be notified when I go live, for instance. It is really worth watching. It is a really worth watching video. I'm going to tell my friends your video, which gave me the impression. Thank you so much. Oh, Namadi Young, thank you. I appreciate that. That's a great compliment. I actually have a whole playlist about Hanbok on this channel. I've done a bunch of different videos, so if you're interested in checking out more historical Korean fashion content, I've got a whole playlist here that you can check out after this. What was footwear like? Okay, can I trust you all to stay there if I run and unfortunately my assistant is not here. Oh, he is. Can you bring shoes, please?
Which hat?
Yours, because I don't think I have, I don't have a good pair of mine. Yeah. Yeah, we have a pair of men's shoes. But the women's shoes were, yeah, it's fine. These are yours. This is slightly modernized because of the heel. I don't have a historic pair because you can't get historic replicas of these. You just can't. It's very frustrating. I haven't seen them, and everyone has asked about it is like, why would you want that? Those must be so uncomfortable. Literally, that's what Koreans tell me. Why would you want the historical replicas of shoes? That must be so uncomfortable. Okay, so this is technically a man's shoe. You can see it's got a turned up. Could you also bring your jogori, your white one with the big sleeves? Right. So it's got the cute little upturned toe, and this style, this general silhouette of shoe stays in fashion for a couple of 100 years. That's what it looks like from above. And this is a man's shoe. Man's shoe. There were also boots, but those boots were only worn by soldiers or by people wearing soldierly clothing. Even when they rode, men wore this generally if they weren't wearing soldiers' clothing. The women's shoes were very similar. They just actually were much more open, much more open on their front. They had a much bigger opening, and they were flat. That heel is a modern concession to modern footwear. They were completely flat. They were made out of a combination of leather and fabric, generally, and very, very carefully constructed footwear, very sophisticated. They also actually sometimes had wooden shoes. They also sometimes had metal overshoes. And I even saw a pair of mulberry paper hanji shoes from about 100 years ago that were not an art piece. They were actually made to be worn. And they were pretty bulky. They had a pretty chunky sole, actually. Is Ryan's shoe comfy? He doesn't find them comfortable, but this is a cheap version made of synthetic This is not real leather. This is not particularly comfortable. If we had a historical one made, it would probably be better. Okay, so here are the pocket sleeves of which I was speaking. And if you see, bend your arm forward, you've got an opening that's only big enough for the hand, right? And then you can put things in the pocket. You really need to take this and get it cleaned.
Yeah.
The Joseon gentleman storage system.
They can't see my face, but I'm super smiling right now because I love the pocket.
He loves the pockets, and sometimes he overstuffs the pockets like men do, right?
Yeah.
Niche cobbler market acquired. Yeah, right? Right? It's to the point where because we've been experimenting with making 15th century overshoes, pianelle, and patents that I'm thinking about, well, we should just segue into Joseon fashions.
Oh, that's my other shirt because I just threw it on.
Yeah, so this is a style of jogori from the mid Joseon dynasty, and one of the sleeve options are these big sleeves. But this is not the underlayer. He should have a joksam under this, and he doesn't, which is why this one is getting really nasty dirty.
That's super nasty. Jesus.
Oh, Ayla, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. I hope to see you in the next one. Yep, just see if there were any comments.
To the side.
I was checking the comments. Right, this is called a keja. So this is more of a mid-Joseon garment. I haven't seen evidence of these keja in the 16th century. Doesn't mean they didn't exist, I just haven't seen the evidence of it. So this is more of a 17th or 18th century style garment. It's called and 19th century style garment. It's called a keja. And it's turned to the side. It's open on the side. It has a vent on the side so he could ride if he needed to, right? Perfectly good for riding. And it's completely lined in silk, and it's, silk on the outside, silk on the inside. So very clearly a nobleman's garment. Yangbun, right? Gaia? Susan, are you talking about the Gaia period? Or Haya? Gaia. You're talking about the Gaia dynasty? Oh, these are not historical Paji.
Oh, well, never mind then.
No.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
This
So
silk is
if you
more-
come to Korea and you want to have hanbok made, and you want it to be historical hanbok, it will not be. No matter how hard you try, no matter how many pictures you show them, no matter how many diagrams you draw for them, they will still make the garments you say you want in the modern way. They will give it a modern armscye. They will cut the pants to be like modern pants with belt loops and with elastic and all the things. No matter how hard you try, the average hanbok maker in Korea will not make it the historic way. I've failed so often to have the historic versions made. That's why I started deciding to research it and make it myself. Okay, Handsome, do you know what I did with the finger loop braiding thread, silk thread? Where is it?
It's on your bench there.
The silk? I don't see it. Did the kitties make off with it? Our kitties are so naughty.
Because the cats had taken it and batted it around the room.
Oh, well, I think they took it and batted it around the room again.
It was just right here yesterday.
Yeah, I bet it was. We have kitties. The kitties like to steal things. The kitties especially like to steal our textile things, especially spools of yarn and
What I
thread.
did to the yarn?
Yeah, this is
Sleeve.
kitties chewing on paper and cardboard the way they do. Okay, does anyone have any questions about historical garments? About historical Korean garments, about how they're made? There's a lot of noise now coming from the background, isn't there? Did they knock it back there?
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, I figured as much. Wow, okay.
And all sorts of weird
Yeah,
stuff.
if you have any questions about historical Korean garments, just pop them in the live chat. There it is! Wow, there's only one left. Wow, where was that?
It was under this?
Jesus.
Where did the fuck did they...
Okay.
Bloody cats.
Yeah, bloody cats indeed. Right.
Wait, now I get to look at it and see how mine compares.
Yeah, you do. Okay. Right. So moving on to the
She just pounded the ends together. This is all just pounded.
Yep.
Wait, I can do that.
But pound it until it melds into one, basically. Yep. So yeah, moving on to the hemp josam, the hemp undergarment. Now, the silk joksam was sewn with silk thread, and the hemp garment was sewn with either hemp thread or no, that's not the one. Although that's a good one to have back. Oh, look, another wow, kitties. Look at all the things we're finding that the kitties have knocked under every piece of furniture. Anyway, the hemp joksam. Now, the curator wasn't certain if it was hemp or reamy. Apparently, they haven't done any testing. It looked and felt to my eye much more like hemp than reamy. It was not very finely woven, and reamy tends to be very finely woven. And she was pretty certain that it was sewn with either hemp or reamy thread, which is very interesting.
It was slubby.
It was slubby. Yeah, both the hemp joksam and the silk joksam were slubby, indeed. Kitties are still less destructive than the average dog. 100% hashtag kitty propaganda. Yeah, kitties are absolutely the superior pet. I will die on that hill. Speaking of superior pets.
Is it me? Am I the superior?
You are the superior pet. There's a superior pet. Hi, Timmy. Hey, baby. Yeah, he came to join. He likes to join on his ledge over there when I'm live streaming in here. Denmark, good morning. Oh my gosh. It is very, very early in Denmark, or very, very late, depending on how you count time, I guess.
Okay, somehow that's just gone.
Right. We'll find it later at some point. Oh well. Oh well. Oh well. If you're enjoying this live stream, don't forget to double tap your screen. And we are talking about historical Korean garments today. And if you have questions about, culture in Korea historically, then pop them in the comments. And if I know the answer, I will let you know. And if I don't, I will tell you I don't know. But I have been studying Korean history, historical Korean culture, and historical Korean fashion for several years now. And have been doing a lot of exploration of museums and historical sites here. I've been working with one of the world's renowned fashion historians, experts in Korean historical fashion, so I have a lot of information to share with you. Yeah. Was that a comb? Yes, it was. It's like 4:46 a.m. in Denmark, but I will say very early morning. Oh, you're half Danish, half Korean. Well, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Daegu, South Korea. It is a beautiful spring day here, and the cherry trees are finally blossoming, and the world is turning into a lovely, delicate shade of pink everywhere. A much superior cherry tree to the Japanese cherry trees, I will say. No bias. Hashtag Korea rules. So, yeah, the hemp joksam. Both of these joksam are very voluminous, by the way. They are not fitted at all. They are the 16th century in Korea, in the Joseon dynasty, is a time of affluence and prosperity. And so the clothing recognizes that, reflects that by being very large, long sleeves, wide sleeves, full bodies, super full skirts that drag on the ground. And so these garments are not fitted. They look like they are made for a woman 5 times the size of the woman in which they were buried, right? But they're not. It's intentionally supposed to be oversized. And actually the irony is that a lot of Korean women now are still wearing these massively oversized garments. They're just Gucci, and they're tracksuits. They're like these sweatsuits and tracksuits that are just massively sweaters, and these sweatshirts and pants that are just massively oversized that completely obscure the shape of their body, but they're designer brands. So it's Gucci, it's Chanel, it's Louis Vuitton, it's all these haute couture designers, but it's still a sweatsuit. Yeah. So yeah, Isabella, if you have any questions about Korean historical fashion, then yeah, lay it in there. I'm happy to answer it. So this hemp joksam was also very interesting in that it made maximum use of the selvages. So the edge, the hem, not the hem, there is no hem. The edge of the sleeve is selvage and has no hem. No point in wasting time on that. The bottom of the joksam, this hem is actually hemmed, and it's double hemmed, it's double rolled, it's a rolled hem, and it's really, really thick. It's surprisingly thick, which shocked me a little bit. On the opening, there's a split on the side so that, you know, when it comes down over the hips, then it doesn't bind the body, not that it would at that volume of fabric. But the opening on the split is selvage. And again, they have not bothered putting in a hem, because why hem something if it doesn't need to be finished? So there was, there's just so many interesting things about this garment. And it is actually both very complicated to make because it is entirely geometric construction, which means it's just rectangles and squares, mostly rectangles, that are put together. And so everything has to line up perfectly or it ends up wonky. But there's also a certain simplicity in that it's cut in such a way that not a single bit of fabric is wasted. Not a single bit. Now, the interesting thing about both of these joksam is that they show no closure. There's no koram, and there's no evidence that there ever was. There's no apparent spot where there was a seam and the koram went away. So I suspect that these joksam, and they cross over. They do cross over like this, right? The left crosses over the right. I suspect that it was just so voluminous that it didn't need koram to stay closed. And it was going to go ultimately, it was going to be tied under a chima, right? So I think the joksam actually got tied under the waistband of the skirt. And so the skirt actually held it closed. So no evidence of ties on this style of joksam. And that makes sense because, again, this is the garment that goes right against your skin. You don't want lots and lots of ties in layers because there's going to be more layers that come over top of that. In the 16th century, the next layer would actually be a jogori that comes to about here, but it's also voluminous. And then over top of that would come this kind of what I call super jogori, a tangi basically, a long jogori that actually in the 15th century goes down to the knees, but by the 16th century goes down to about mid-hip. And that would go over top of all of that. So you just don't want lots of extra bulk from the ties. So it makes sense that the joksam would be therefore tie free. It doesn't need it because it's going to you're going to put on the joksam and then the skirt goes over top of that. Skirts go over top of that. And so that will hold it in place. And it's the bottommost layer anyway. So, oh, well, thank you, Isabella. Zach, no hats. Oh, hats. Oh, yes to hats. Yes, not women though. Not women. Women don't wear much in the way of hats. They wear ornaments in their hair and they wear wigs, but they don't wear much in the way of hats. Men. Joseon is known as the land of 1,000 hats also because they have a hat for almost every occasion. They have a hat for every kind of ceremony. They have a hat for every stage of life. They even have a special funerary hat. They have hats that signify rank or position in society. They have functional hats. They have so many kinds of hats, and many of them are made from horsehair. They're either made from straw, or they're woven out of grass, or they're made of bamboo, or they are woven out of horsehair. And yeah, so there are lots of hats depending on the era of the Joseon dynasty in question. The most typical hat that everyone knows from K-dramas is the gat. We don't have one at the moment. We need to buy a new one, but that's the wide brimmed black horsehair hat that's basically translucent and it has a truncated cone coming out of the top of it and it's kind of perched on the front of the head like this and ties under the neck. That's called a kat. And that's a daily wear hat worn by the yangban. The lower classes would have a hat that had a smaller brim and or would be made out of straw or bamboo. Yeah, so hats. Yes, men wore hats. Men wore lots of different kinds of hats depending on their function. Women really didn't have much in the way of hat wear with the exception of the frame hat, the dongmo, which is this frame hat. And the dongmo started as a hat it was basically, could you bring my dongmo, Hansa? Are you there? My dongmo, my frame hat. Right, so the women wore a frame hat. Is the earliest visual evidence I have of this frame hat is the 16th century. That doesn't mean it doesn't predate it. It's just the earliest evidence I've found. And basically it's like a giant wooden salad bowl turned upside down. And it has fabric over top of it, but then a veil went over top of that. And in the early Joseon dynasty, all women wore them. But in the later Joseon dynasty, giseng start being the ones to wear them, and instead the noble women, what they wear when they go out.
Couldn't get it off the hook.
Right. This is a modern costume one. Right. This is how the giseng would wear them, especially by the 18th century. They would wear them in this jaunty fashion, kind of perched on the side of their head. But as you can see, it keeps the rain and the sun off. Right. And when I say costume version, yes, it's hand painted, but this is definitely designed for a stage performance, so you can see it from out in the audience. But the frame is, so this is the frame, right? Let's see different angles. And you can actually find these sometimes in antique stores, actually, to this day. But the way noble women would have worn these is they had a veil, a very complex, very carefully tailored veil that would go over top. And some of these have actually survived. One has survived from the 16th century, a knoll. It's called knoll. And it's actually cut in panels, trapezoids, so that it fits perfectly over the frame and has this beautiful little like petal top sewn onto it. And that usually drapes to about here. And that actually then drapes and covers the woman basically down to here. We actually have depictions of women riding horses wearing these. And in the early to mid Joseon, all women were wearing this. But starting, it seems, in about the 18th century, noble women, respectable women, shall we say, stop wearing this version of a hat, and they just start wearing their dang-ot. Dang-ot means literally long clothing. But it's basically, could you bring me my turumagi? Any of them? The coat thing. The Korean coat thing that we got at the secondhand market. Yeah, that. So they start wearing what used to be an long outer garment that they would wear outside in when it was cool or cold. Basically like if you took this joggery and just continued it in an A line, angling out to about the ground or just above the ground. And it had sleeves, bringing a sort of modern-ish version because I don't have an historic one yet. They stopped wearing those as coats, and instead they actually put them over their heads and started wearing them like a kind of veil. And so if you ever see in the Korean K-dramas, the period K-dramas, when the women are out and about and they've got this coat-like thing over their head and they've got it secured under their chin with their hands like this, that's a dang-ot. And that's what the noble women started wearing on their heads only when they were out. And it was basically a way of covering their heads and their bodies. Right. So this is called a
Oh.
it
seemed weird.
This is called a turumagi.
Thought I took it off.
It's actually a man's overgarment now, but it kind of vaguely replicates just for demonstration purposes. So this is the kind of thing that women by mid Joseon were wearing instead of this dongmo, the frame hat, right? They were wearing this when they would go out and about, and it would actually have special ties right here, so they could tie it under their chin, and then there would be a second set of ties a little bit lower down so that it would actually stay closed when they walked around. But that was not a fashion choice. It wasn't something they wore inside. They only wore it when they went outside. They would also sometimes actually wear their chima, and I'll show you what that looks like. They would actually sometimes just wear a skirt over top of their head like a veil instead of a dang-ot. So that would look a little bit like this. Right, so they would wear, it would look a little bit like this. And they would actually go around and they would actually hold it under their chin like this. And it would just sort of veil their whole bodies like this. So we also see women doing that as well mid-Joseon. So by the 18th century, we start seeing that. But otherwise, women aren't really wearing a hat like a fashion item. They're either wearing it to keep the sun and or the weather off of themselves for the frame hat in the earlier period. Then the giseng wear them only when they're out and about, but they take them off once they're inside. Or they're wearing the dang-ot or a chima over their heads like a veil if they're respectable women. But otherwise, the men have all the hats, really. The women don't really do much in terms of hat wearing. Instead, they have, the binyo, the nice hair ornaments, and depending on their rank or their station, they might have nice ornaments that go in their wigs as well. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Vickerness. Appreciate that. I'm Korean. Are you wearing hanbok? Yes. Lena, Lena, yes, I am wearing, so this is 18th century style hanbok. So this is mid Joseon, not modern style. So it's cut in a different way. You can see it has gores under little square gussets under the arms, right? And it doesn't have a sleeve seam, so it's, it doesn't have a round arm's eye anyway. So you get that nice sexy V that frames the body, and it's not really loose and it comes lower. And the chima are worn around the waist, right? So this is multiple layers, multiple layers. So we have, instead of paji, I have dansokot, which are basically like culottes made of hemp, right? And then we have a couple of skirt sokchima, basically. And then we have two different moshi chima, reimi chima, a purple one and a blue one. And as I was saying, and I'll demonstrate this, in the 18th century, it seems that the fashion becomes to pin or sew up the overlayer, your over the top chima, in such a way that you can see that it creates a really fun gather, and so that then you can see the purple skirt underneath, right? So this started to be a fashion in the 18th century, to pin up the top layer like that. Pin up or sew up the top layer so that you'd get that fun layered effect. Yeah. Let me see. I wonder why they ever stopped. The hat seems so practical. Wearing repurposed clothes like that is a bit odd. Maybe the fabrics were nice and they wanted to show them off. Yeah, fashion is fashion, right? So it was probably maybe some very stylish giseng might have even been the first person to demonstrate the use of the chima or the dangot as a kind of veil. Or it might have been that the giseng were really doing, more and more things out in public wearing the dongmo. And so the respectable women thought, well, we need to do something different to distinguish ourselves. And what can we do? Well, we already have this jong-ot that we wear on a daily basis. How hard is it to just put it over our head? I could even see that it was raining. Some lady got caught out in the rain, and she had her jong-ot on over her clothes, and so she propped it up over her head. And the way it frames the face is actually kind of lovely and adorable when it's the proper jong-ot or the proper chima. So I could see how that could be considered attractive in a very flirty sort of peekaboo kind of way. And so that could also be yet another way in which Joseon women, asserted their own sort of flirty nature despite the strictures of Neo-Confucianism. Yeah, those are all theories. I haven't read any actual official documents from the era talking about why they switched from the dongmo to using the jangot or the chima as the head covering and veiling when they go outside. Yeah. Hat use in general declined with the spread of controlled environments and white collar jobs. Oh yeah, in the modern world, 100%. Yeah. And also, in the West in particular, there was a big movement to the counterculture movement of the 60s, right? Was we can't do things the way our parents and grandparents did them because we're different and we don't want to be formal and we don't want to wear gloves and we don't want to wear hats. We want to be free. Right, so that's one of the reasons that went away in general. But yeah, same with cloaks. She said, Chima. Yes, I can also spell Chima in Korean, in Hangul. Yeah, so yeah, this is an 18th century style ensemble. This is not the modern silhouette at all, just to be clear. Yeah, the casualization of the 60s, blah, for absolutely. Just take a moment. Welcome to my medieval sewing party. Today I'm talking about 16th century and 17th and 18th century clothing from the Joseon dynasty. If you have any questions about historical Korean fashion, about historical Korean culture, pop them in the live chat. I will answer them to the best of my current state of knowledge. If you're enjoying, double tap that screen and consider subscribing. I have an entire playlist just focused on historical hanbok. If you're interested in checking that out after this, I've put together a lot of shorts, some interesting full-length videos with a lot of interesting information. Yeah, the casualization of the 70s, it was the worst time. I actually bought fabric to make a naol for this jongmo, the veil. It is a beautiful green mochi, and it's fine enough, Rami, and it's fine enough that if when you're looking from the inside out, you can see through it, but you can't see this way. So it's very clever. That's definitely on my project list. Where did Rami sit on the socioeconomic hierarchy of Joseon fabrics? High. That's a good question. Rami was an expensive fabric. It was and is an expensive fabric. The production of Rami is very, very production intensive. Cotton is much simpler. It's much simpler, and they had cotton. There's a native cotton industry here in Korea starting in about the Shilla dynasty, also a native indigo industry. And so cotton is much easier to turn into fabric than Rami is. Rami is a plant, like linen, it's like flax, and it is very labor intensive to turn it from a grass into a fine, fine fabric. So Rami is definitely an upper class fabric. Hemp is not. Hemp is a lower class fabric. Hemp and cotton were the fabric choices of the lower classes for certain. Rami is, it wasn't regulated. It's just that it was not an affordable fabric for most people. Yeah. Yeah. What jewels could women of Joseon wear? Jade. I mean, they could. So I haven't read any regulations about jewels. That doesn't mean they're not there. I just haven't read any regulations forbidding or outlawing the wearing of certain jewels. I do know for a fact that they wore jade and coral. Jade was very popular, of course, and jade has been very popular as a jewel in what is now Korea, all of Korea, the Korean Peninsula, since ancient times, and I mean since the first millennium, because there are so many jade objects that have survived in the archaeological record. It's very clear that it has always held a fascination for Asians. And so yeah, jade, we're talking like on the binya, frequently you'll see a jade piece here on the end, right? In sometimes you'll see jade pieces when you get a norige, the pendant that in this era they were generally actually suspending from the korum, right? You get worked jade motifs, pieces that are built into the norige, that pendant that they would wear. So yeah, jade was very, very popular. Jade and coral are the two primary precious stones that spring to mind, which isn't necessarily all of them, but yeah. Really different to stinging nettle fabric though, yeah. Yes, so yes, mochi is Rami. It is a nettle. It is not stinging nettle. Yes, Rami comes from nettle, but it is not stinging nettle. That is correct. Yeah, pearls. Have I seen pearls? I mean, yes, they had pearls. They must, yes, absolutely. Pearls, 100% pearls. Thinking about a visit to the Daegu National Museum. Absolutely pearls. Yeah. Lots, but the thing is that in the Joseon dynasty, modesty was heavily emphasized. And so bling was minimized and only worn in very moderate and specific amounts. So, for example, the men had that top knot. There was a top knot pin, and that top knot pin would sometimes have like a little piece of jade on it or a little piece of gold on it. Right? It would be very minor, and that top knot is almost never visible to anyone because noblemen in Joseon are nearly always wearing something on their head. They're wearing a gat, or if they're in their homes and there's a different kind of hat they would wear then. So you almost would never actually see it, but it's there and they would know it's there. The men would also wear a mangyeon, which is that headband that basically goes around their heads like this. And it actually helps keep their hair neat and keeps flyaways from coming down into their face. And they would actually have two buttons, one on each side here, where the straps, you would actually take the straps, run them through the buttons, and then run them back and tie them at the back of the head to stabilize the mangyeon. And the mangyeon, and that those could sometimes be made of jade if you're wealthy. They could be made of jade. So there were like little ways to have ornamentation, but it was especially as the Joseon dynasty moved later and later, there was an increasing focus on modesty of attire across all levels of society. And one of the worst things that the Joseon dynasty, that this Neo-Confucian modesty did to the Korean fabric industry is that they actually outlawed I don't remember which king it was. One of the kings in mid Joseon outlawed the weaving of the beautiful brocades for which Korea had actually become famous by then. Starting in the Shilla, I mean, even in the Shilla dynasty, Korea was exporting these amazing brocades they were weaving to China, no less. But Joseon king comes along and says, "Oh, Neo-Confucian modesty is the best. We can't be weaving all of these fancy, fancy fabrics because that counteracts the narrative of modesty." And so he outlaws the weaving of these fabrics. And so Korean weaving technology, those looms are literally destroyed. So Korean weaving technology takes a nosedive in the mid Joseon dynasty. And it's one of the many ways in which Neo-Confucianism completely retarded progress in Korea for centuries and which is why it's what ultimately brings Joseon to an end, right? So yeah, that was really tragic. That happened in the mid Joseon dynasty, and you can see a difference in the clothing. So the jogori that survived from the first half of the 18th century, they're made out of much fancier brocades and damasks than the extant jogori from the end of the 18th and into the 19th century, which are made from much plainer silks. So you can see the change almost instantly. It's pretty sharp. Yeah. Okay, Ursula, thank you for joining in. Appreciate your support as always. Thank you for being a member. And I will be posting a write-up about the cherry blossom 15th century Italian cherry blossom cheesecake we made yesterday. I promise. Pandidolid, Pandidolod, welcome to my community. I'm the creative Contessa, and I love sharing knowledge about historical material culture, Korean and European fashion, about how people lived, about what they ate, about all of these things I discover in my research. So welcome to my creative community, and I hope to see you again. Thank you for joining us this morning. What was distinct to categorize it as Neo-Confucianism versus Confucianism? Probably because there was a gap between, as far as I can tell, it's because I actually don't know enough about original Confucianism to answer that question. But in Korea, there is no Confucianism for centuries and centuries and centuries, and then Taejo introduces it as the religion is a really strong word because it's not really treated like Confucianism is not treated like a religion in Korea, ironically, because there are Confucian temples in places like Taiwan and Japan, right? But it's not a religion, but it's a government ethos. It becomes the underpinning, the foundational society ethos is what Neo-Confucianism becomes. And I think it's probably referred to as neo because it's like Neoplatonists, right? It's a new movement of it. It's a readoption of it, separate from the original movement. I expect that's probably why. But Neo-Confucianism is extremely hierarchical. It focuses on modesty and order. And for women, it's the worst because women are at the bottom of the hierarchy in Neo-Confucianism, which also means that if there's a famine, guess who doesn't get to eat until everyone else is eaten? The women. The women are the last ones to eat. The children actually get to eat, and not the girl. And so boy children first, then girl children, then adult men, then women, and usually the elderly women, and then the young women, right? Like the childbearing age women, right? So Neo-Confucianism is, and if there's not enough meat to go around, then the boys get the meat, not the girls, which is why even to this day you see a big height discrepancy between Korean men and Korean women because they grew up in an era where there wasn't necessarily much money and the family focused on making sure the little boy had meat and the girl didn't. Yeah, kind of sad. Yeah. Yeah, so Nevis, I've actually been to Confucian temples where they treat it like a religion, but not Korea. It didn't have temples. It didn't have that kind of level of worship. They actually view Kongfutse as a kind of deity. It's very interesting, but it wasn't like that here in Korea. Yeah. Let me see. I'm guessing Korea had a lot of varying fashions and some Sharia laws, just like Europe. No. So Korea did not have sumptuary laws like Europe. It did not. What they had were rule, as far as I can tell, Shilla, Goryeo, and Joseon dynasty. I haven't really been able to find laws that regulated what people wore on a daily basis. The laws I have found all relate to official clothing and to what you are supposed to wear in your official capacity within the government or the court. So their colors are regulated. Their cuts of garments are regulated, and the occasions on which you're supposed to wear which garments are regulated. But I haven't really been able to find the equivalent regulations for civil, what I call civilian wear, for non-official wear, which is interesting. But it also might be an indication that there wasn't such a that the merchant class wasn't really necessarily catching up as much to the Yangban or the royal family, so there wasn't as much a need to maintain those distinctions through sumptuary legislation. Could indicate that. Now, if anyone has out there has found sumptuary regulation for civilian wear in historical Korea, in Shilla or Goryeo or Joseon, I'd be really interested to hear that. But I've talked to Professor Dr. Minji or Dr. Kim, Minji Kim, about this, and we're back. I don't know. YouTube is possessed by an evil demon. As far as she knows, as far she has not found any legislation or any sumptuary rules, any fashion rules. An interesting distinction. Yeah, if people can't afford it, no need for a law is a theory I have. Again, I haven't been able to chase that line of inquiry down as much as I would like. And that's in part because there is absolutely a language barrier. Almost all of the books, all of the papers on this topic have been published in Korean, and my Korean is at a 4-year-old level. Academic Korean is a whole nother ballgame. However, I will say that with the translation apps that are now available, I am actually starting to be able to work my way through many of those papers. But even still, finding them is a bit of a challenge in some cases. Where did pregnant women fit into the famine hierarchy? Oh, pregnant women probably were fed. Because they could have a boy in their belly. So pregnant women were fed. But if you weren't pregnant, then they can always get another woman if you don't make it. Great times. Great times. Let's see. Just making sure I didn't miss any comments here. Yeah. Okay. Right. So we're coming up on the end of this morning's stream. So, but are there any final questions about Korean fashion, about daily life in any given historical period in Korea? I can answer the questions about daily life a little bit. I'm still finding that information, as I mentioned, thanks to the translation apps that are really helping me to actually find and read these papers that have been written. Part of my big research project, for those who don't know, I am in the midst of a major research project in collaboration with Dr. Minji Kim to explore how 16th and 17th century and 18th century garments in Korea were constructed, the materials out of which they were made, the seams that were used, the order of operations, which seams came first, which seams came next, how were things finished, right? So we're working on that project. I will be remaking these garments, and we're going to be writing up papers on it and doing presentations and all kinds of things. So we're in the middle of this research project. I'm going to Korean museums and actually examining extant historical garments firsthand. Right. So this is part of the research. So I'm not just relying on pictures. I'm not even just standing on one side of the glass and looking at garments on display. I'm actually looking at them firsthand because that's the only way I can really get an idea. Just looking at these garments firsthand that I did look at. What?
Pixelated again.
Pixelated. Oh, I'm so sorry, guys.
Hopefully that works.
That would explain why the viewership dropped. I'm sorry, everyone. There's a demon here. Last night, I had the most awful time convincing YouTube to actually let me live stream to it, and it kept cutting us off, and it kept doing, I don't know. I think we must have built this. This apartment must be built on an old Yangban burial ground, and they're not happy about that. Yeah. So as I was saying, we're in the middle of this amazing research project, and I have learned so much by looking at these garments firsthand. And I've seen pictures of these garments, and I never would have learned these details from the pictures because the pictures don't show these seams. They don't show this angle. So yeah, been learning a lot, and I'm looking forward to sharing more information with you. As I said, I was originally planning to actually go through pictures with you, but I scheduled this via YouTube and not via my Restream software. So I will be scheduling. Yes, Nevis, I would. Please. Anyway, I will be scheduling another live stream to present some pictures and my initial observations while we go through the pictures together of these extant garments. And I'll show you just how tiny these seams were, just how fine the hems were, just how tiny the stitches are. And then you can get an idea of how to make these garments for yourself, perhaps. Disco Cat says, learning about Neo-Confucianism makes modern Korean society make a bit more sense to me, since it's still part of the foundation of their state. Oh, yes. Let me tell you, Neo-Confucianism is to be felt everywhere here to this day. Now, that's changing. That is changing here. And we have been living in and or traveling around Korea since 2014. We've spent a lot of time here, and we have observed many changes. Many of them, most of them excellent changes. Among them, men and women are now on equal footing. Mothers and fathers share the household responsibilities and the rearing of children. Just the other day, I was out by the cherry blossom trees, and there was a dad with his 3-year-old toddler, and the toddler was walking down the stone wall trying to balance. You know, it was so cute. The toddler was so proud of himself. The dad was so proud. He was filming as he's walking along with his little boy. There was no mom to be seen. Just dad and son. How wonderful is that, right? And I see that all the time now. I see fathers with babies strapped to their chest. I see them pushing strollers. I see them at the playgrounds. So it's absolutely finally changing. Korea is really finally combining the best of both worlds, right? They shouldn't get rid of everything that makes them Korean, but they can definitely get rid of all the stuff that makes it inequitable here, and that is going by the wayside. But you can still see it in interactions. Koreans will not stand up to leadership generally. In an organization, in a club, if the president says we're doing this, no matter how bad of an idea it is, their officers will just nod and say, okay. And now behind their backs, they'll express an opinion, but in the official organization, they will say nothing and they will do nothing to change it. So there's still very much a obey your elders, obey your seniors, obey those who are higher up in the hierarchy. That is deeply entrenched here. And that also means children will accept a lot of garbage from their parents that they shouldn't. They will accept abuse, they will accept neglect, they will enable them because that's all part of Neo-Confucianism as well. So that is probably the last thing that's going to change, unfortunately. Yeah, Disco Cat, thank you for joining us. Koreans stand up to leadership very well. Not in the clubs I've been part of. Not within the club. not not at all. I've been part of multiple Korean clubs for the last many years, since 2014, and that is not the case. If the president says we're doing this, and that's it, it's accepted. Now that's changing probably amongst the younger Koreans, but in the 50 plus crowd, I mean, I'm in Korea, in Korean organizations, and I've been in multiple. And now, granted, granted, you're right, it doesn't represent Koreans as a whole. And Daegu is very conservative. It's the slowest to change of the major cities, I would say. Seoul is a completely different thing. Seoul is a whole other world. I've been in parts of organizations in Seoul, and that was a completely different experience entirely. Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. I mean, Jess, are you Korean? Do you live here in Korean? Or do you live here in Korea also? I forget if you're are you up in Seoul? Yeah, Seoul is a different world. It's very different from Daegu. The people are very different. The attitudes towards everything seem to be very different from when I've interacted. Yeah. Let me see. I notice a lot of white and black people have a misrepresentation of Asians as meek, but people communicate differently. No, no, no. It's not that they're meek. No, 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 no. Mm-mm. I definitely don't mean that they're meek. What I mean is when the president says we're doing this, that's it and done. Now, the conversations that happen behind the president's back are a completely different conversation. I mean, they're not meek, but they just accept it and they generally don't fight up for it. Yeah. White and black people have a misrepresentation of Asians as meek. No. So Jess, are you here in Korea out of curiosity? Do you live in America? Do you live in Korea? Were you born and raised in Korea? Are you an expat here in Korea like I am? Makes me remember the tragedy of that boat that sank and the Korean kids stayed in their cabins because adults told them to. Yes, Disco Cat, that is exactly what I mean. Yeah. Yeah, all those children died. That was the Fukuoka ferry. That was horrific. 100%. Yep. No, no, no. I would never say that Koreans are meek. They are not. I have seen Koreans get into violent screaming matches on a regular basis in the street. Jess, I've been here since 2014, but thank you. Yeah. For my short period. Yeah, again, I keep asking you, Jess, do you live here in Korea? Do you? Because I'm wondering about that. No, I've seen Koreans getting shouting matches. I've seen them get violent. They're not meek, and I would never say they're meek. Mm-mm. Your skirt is not, Jess. This is an 18th century style hanbok. Do you know anything about historical Korean fashion? Do you? Because this is how they were worn in the 18th century, not in the modern era. Oh, Jess. Jess. But again, I'm going to ask you, Jess, do you live in Korea? Okay, Jess, you're gone. Yeah. Yeah, please block her. Yeah. Goodbye, Jess. You keep not answering my question, which makes me think that you probably aren't Korean in Korea. Yeah. Yeah, goodbye, Jess. Goodbye. The airlock is there for you to take anytime. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I get the fact that she wasn't answering my question about whether she was here in Korea makes me think she might not live here, actually, or yeah. Anyway. Okay, everyone. Well, that is it for today's live stream. Everybody drank another dipshit blocked. Yeah. Oh, goodness. For my short time in Korea. I've been here since 2014. I have lots of Korean friends. I participate in a lot of Korean-run organizations, and I travel all over the peninsula, and I've lived all over the peninsula. So, yeah, I think I probably have a better idea about Korea and Koreans than an Korean American who's never lived here, but whatever. Yeah, just to troll people strange on the internet. I'm not wearing my chima properly. For what era? See, and this is what I mean. This is what I mean. Like, if I actually went out and about right now and I had my korum tied in the 18th century way, I would get corrected because they don't understand that this is a historical garment and that things were worn differently in the past. So that woman, Jess, didn't understand that this is an 18th century style hanbok, and that the chima is around the waist, not up here around the chest, and that it is tied like this with the ties wrapped around your waist and then just kind of here on the front or off to the side, right? Yeah. Find me a Korean wife, please. Okay, no. Okay, well, everyone, until next time, I'm trying to think what is today. If you're interested in being notified of when I go live, make sure to click the bell and click all, not just custom. There will be some more random live streams this week, sewing parties, or we might be going actually to Gyeongju and to Daegaya, and we'll probably be doing live streams from those two historic locations. So definitely check that out. This was almost a troll-free vlog, really at the very end, right? Really end. And I'm going to tell you, I get the most crap if I get crap, it's not from Koreans on the live stream. I get crap from American Koreans, Koreans who are born to Korean parents, but were born in America and raised in America. Yeah. Anyway. Okay, everyone. I'd like to thank my patrons and my channel members and my Facebook subscribers for supporting me. If you're interested in access to extra content and supporting my historical material culture research, including clothing and fashion, whether it's Korea or Europe, then consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a YouTube channel member. Comes with a whole host of extra perks, including access to my Discord server. I would also like to thank all of you who left me gems today, and all these other interesting little gifts. And I would like to thank everyone for just being part of the community in all the ways you can, for hitting the thumbs up, for leaving comments, and for participating in the chat. Okay, everyone, until next time, may your adventures in history be creative. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night.